keto diet is quite popular right now, and it seems like no matter where you go, someone is talking about it. But is it a healthy thing to do? That's what we're going to talk about today. So not surprisingly, since the keto diet is so popular, I've received a lot of questions about it and a lot of requests to do a video on it. I think it comes up on almost every live stream I do, and then it's all through the comments of my other videos, and I'm finally here, I'm doing it, we're gonna talk about it. But real quick, before we get into this whole thing, I do wanna let you know, if you are here for the first time, if this is the first time that you're seeing my face, hello, my name is Sarah and I am a registered dietitian, and this channel is all about food and nutrition. So if that's your sort of thing, if you're into that, then make sure that you subscribe. So first we're gonna talk about what a ketogenic diet is and some of the ideas behind it, and then I'm gonna tell you what I think as a registered dietitian. So when a lot of people hear about keto, they think it means just a low carb diet, similar to Atkins, but that really isn't the whole picture here. A ketogenic diet is low carb, but there's a little more to it than that. In addition to being low carb, a ketogenic diet is also moderate in protein and high in fat. And this breakdown comes somewhere around 5% carbs, 20% protein, and 75% fat for the overall diet. And in general, on a ketogenic diet, people are trying to keep their carbs around or less than 20 grams per day. So in terms of actual food, that looks like a moderate amount of protein-rich foods like meats, a high amount of fat-rich foods like olive oil, avocado, cream, butter, coconut oil, some leafy green vegetables, and other very low-carb vegetables, and then no carbohydrate-rich foods like grains, beans, fruits, and starchy vegetables like potatoes. Now, as far as what a ketogenic diet is actually doing to what's going on in your body, a keto diet is all about shifting the fuel source that your body is using. Our body uses glucose as its preferred fuel source, and we get that from the carbohydrates in our diet, as well as the stored carbohydrates in our body, and that comes in the form of glycogen in our liver and in our muscles. But our body also wants to be able to survive when all of that glucose isn't available. And I've talked about in other videos how our body can shift things around in terms of our metabolism, what it's using for fuel, and make adjustments based on what is coming in. And this is a perfect example of that. So if there isn't glucose around to use, our body can shift to using fat primarily for energy instead. And it breaks down the fat into ketone bodies, which then can be used as fuel. So with a ketogenic diet, you're shifting the body from relying on glucose as the main energy source to using ketone bodies as your source of energy. Now, I mentioned that the body gets glucose from carbohydrates, but it can also make glucose from proteins. And that's why it's important to keep protein levels at a moderate amount in a ketogenic diet, because if someone consumes high amounts of protein, then the body can start to use that, convert it into glucose, and then the person wouldn't be in ketosis anymore. Now, as far as the practical aspect of how people actually do keto, some people just rely on tracking alone. So they track their food, they track the amount of carbohydrates that they're getting, they track their protein and their fat, make sure everything is lining up, and then trust that their body is going to go into ketosis, that state where it's using ketones primarily for fuel. Other people take it to the next step and actually do some testing to see what their ketone levels are. And then, of course, there are lots of different gurus who promote a ketogenic diet. So with that, a lot of them have their own spins or different versions of it, different variations. Sometimes they also combine it with other diets as well. So now that we've got the basics of what a ketogenic diet is, why do people do keto? Well, until here recently, ketogenic diets were primarily used as a therapeutic diet to treat and reduce seizures in children with epilepsy. And it's been used this way since the 1920s. This is how I learned about ketogenic diets in school to become a dietitian, was kind of within this context as a therapeutic diet for children with epilepsy. And also the vast majority of research on ketogenic diets is around the treatment of epilepsy and reducing seizures. But here recently, it has become popular with the general public, mainly as a weight loss diet. And then some people will also say that it's just a good thing for general health. It isn't all about weight and weight loss, and that it's really something that people should be doing just to feel feel better and to be healthier. Now let's talk about what I think about it as a registered dietitian. So like all diets, a ketogenic diet is restrictive. Some diets restrict how much you eat, some diets restrict when you eat, some diets restrict what you eat. And keto falls into that last camp. A ketogenic diet restricts the types of foods that you eat. And there's a little bit of restricting amounts in there as well. For example, you can have protein-rich foods on a ketogenic diet, but you have to watch the amount that you're having. You can't go over a certain limit if you want to stay in ketosis. So it's a little bit of a combination of those two types of restriction. So just because you can eat a lot of fat-rich foods doesn't mean that a ketogenic diet isn't restrictive. A lot of times with various diets, people will point to the foods that you are allowed to eat in abundance or the things that you can have and say that means that a diet isn't restrictive. But we have to look at a diet as a whole, and if you are cutting out foods or having to track or count or restrict your amounts, then that's restriction no matter if you can have a lot of other foods in the diet. Now let me be clear with this one. Restriction is no good. Restriction sets you up for binging and out of control eating. It's this pendulum swing that I talk about a lot of time in my videos. So when you restrict a food or the amounts of food you're eating, whatever, when you do any type of restriction, you're kind of pulling the pendulum back to one side. And you can do that for a little while, right? But eventually something is gonna break, and it's a totally normal response. A lot of times people, when they can't do the restriction anymore, they think, oh, it's my fault, it's a personal failure. But it's because of what your body is doing to get you to freaking eat, honestly. So your body is increasing your cravings and your hunger, decreasing your fullness, all of these different things that your body is doing to get you to eat the amounts or eat the thing that you're not allowed to have. So you restrict, restrict, restrict. Eventually, it swings the other way, and then you end up in some sort of binge or feeling out of control, and it just goes back and forth. And for a lot of people, when they have that sort of binging, overeating happen, they think, wow, I really need to restrict because I can't control myself around food. But that's not the case at all. You're doing one extreme and your body is pushing back, again, a totally normal response to keep you alive and well and to keep you eating. Totally normal, your body pushes back and you go to the other extreme. So a lot of people will end up going back to restricting, but really that is the problem. That's what's causing this pendulum to swing back and forth. You can also think of it kind of as a circle. You restrict, which leads to a binge, and then because of that binge, you restrict again, which leads to another binge, and it just goes on and on and on. It's the same way with any diet. Keto is no different. Restriction can also lead to food fear, preoccupation with food, and obsession with food. And then on top of that, it's exacerbated by the tracking that's required with the keto diet, because you have to be tracking what you're eating, counting up those macro numbers, and making sure everything is getting in the right place. So when you have the restriction on its own and then the tracking and counting on top of that, that can set you up for a lot of problems. And one of those problems is that when you are micromanaging your food by counting and tracking everything you eat, it disconnects you from your body's own internal cues. It disconnects you from your body's hunger and fullness signals. It disconnects you from your body's cravings and what foods your body is asking for, because instead of listening to what your body is saying, paying attention to what sounds good right now, you're using these outside numbers to determine what you're gonna eat. Now, there will be some people who say that the opposite of everything I've just said is true, that, for example, having the rules of a keto diet helps them to not be preoccupied with food or to not obsess over food, or that, it helps them to not have any sort of binging or overeating or anything along those lines. But that is just a temporary state. You see, dieting gives us a sort of high. When we start out, there's all these things going on that just make us feel great. We like following the rules and doing what we're supposed to and getting the little check or the gold star. It's all very exciting, and there's a lot of other factors involved too. I actually have a video where I talk about why we like diets so much. So if you haven't seen that one, or if you need a refresher, I'll link that for you because I go into it in much more detail there. But the bottom line is diets make us feel good in the beginning, but that never lasts. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that pendulum swing or that kind of dieting cycle. When we come over here and restrict, we feel like we're following the rules and everything is going great, but it never lasts. Our body pushes back because it wants us to eat, because it wants us to survive, and we swing the other way, we get caught in that cycle where we feel like it's our fault and we have to restrict again, and see, this here proves that I have to have these rules in place, when really, in order to get out of the cycle, we have to get rid of the rules and break away from them. And that goes with the rules of keto or any other diet that's out there. And that brings me to my next point, which is a keto diet could lead to an eating disorder, just like any other diet. When you start off dieting and restricting, for some people, that's just kind of the first toe in, and then it leads them down the path of an eating disorder. And for a lot of people who have eating disorders, the way that they got started was by going on a diet. A ketogenic diet also limits the variety of foods you can eat and cuts out healthy foods like fruits and starchier vegetables and grains and legumes. And this is a problem for two reasons. When you limit variety, it limits your access to certain nutrients. Yes, maybe you could hit everything if you track and count, and it is possible and you could do it. But again, counting and tracking and having to like micromanage your food isn't a healthy thing to do. It's not a natural thing to do. It's not something that we need to do. Our body can take care of things if we just eat a variety and let it do the rest. Also, limiting variety can decrease your enjoyment of food because you don't have as many options. Maybe you have to cut out foods that you really, really like to be on a ketogenic diet, and that's no good. Some people can also have constipation issues on a keto diet because they are removing some of the fiber sources from their life previously. So they're cutting out those grains and those beans and the fruits and the starchier vegetables. So if someone isn't really going heavy on those low carb veggies, then their fiber intake could be cut, and then they might have some constipation issues as a result of that. Now let's talk about the results, because with everything that I've said, I'm sure there will still be people who say, okay, I don't care about all of those negatives. What I care about is the results that I'm trying to get, or the results that I have had by doing keto. The first result that most people talk about and are looking for with keto is weight loss. And yes, lots of people do lose weight on ketogenic diets, and there are a few reasons for that. The first reason is that cutting out foods means that you're probably gonna eat less food overall, and a ketogenic diet requires you to cut out several food groups: grains, legumes, fruits, and starchier vegetables, just to keep those carb numbers as low as they need to be. So if you were eating those foods as a part of your diet and now you can't because of keto, you might find that you just eat less food because you're not really sure how to replace, or you're not kind of making up for those losses. So less food means weight loss. Another reason is that eating fat makes you feel full. This is something I've talked about in a lot of my videos. Fat is an important part of any meal to help you feel full and satisfied. And so I could definitely see, especially for someone who maybe was eating a low-fat diet prior to trying keto, so maybe they were never really feeling satisfied after their meals because they weren't having fat in there, and so perhaps they were doing a lot of kind of mindless eating, grazing, munching, trying to search for that satisfaction but never finding it. And now that they've switched from one extreme to the other of being extremely high fat, they're finally feeling that satisfaction, and now they're not doing that extra eating that maybe they were doing before. Water weight is also playing a role here. So the carbohydrate stores in your body are called glycogen, and that's found in your liver and in your muscles. And with it also comes a lot of water. So when someone first goes on a ketogenic diet, their body is gonna burn through those glycogen stores as a source of glucose before it moves on to making ketone bodies and using the ketones for fuel. And when the body burns through all that glycogen, you're also going to have all of that water release too. And this is why a lot of people will see a large weight loss in the beginning of a diet like this, because they're losing all of that water weight. I also want to point out that just because something results in weight loss doesn't mean that it's a healthy thing to do. I think we get trapped in this mindset that losing weight equals good for you or healthy, and that's just not the case. There are lots of things that could cause you to lose weight that wouldn't be very good for you at all. So you can't just hold up weight loss and say, well, that's happening, so that means that whatever the methods are, that's a good thing. It doesn't really matter, because if the weight loss is happening, then that means it's good. That's not how this works. Now, to argue against all of this, some proponents of a ketogenic diet will say, no, keto is a healthy thing for people to do, and here's why. So the first thing they usually point to is that ketogenic diets have been used as a treatment for epileptic seizures in children for a long time. And so they kind of say, because this diet is good for treating that medical condition, then that means it's a healthy thing for everyone. They'll also point to the limited research that we have around ketogenic diets and various medical conditions. And they'll say, look, there's research going on about keto helping with this. That means that keto is good for you. So here's the thing you have to understand with all this. Just because a diet or anything else really is a treatment for a specific medical condition, that doesn't mean that it's a good thing or a healthy thing for the general population to just be doing because. Just because some people are allergic to almonds and are much healthier when they don't eat almonds because they're not having allergic reactions, doesn't mean that almonds are terrible and no one should be eating them because they cause this reaction in some people. Just because people with kidney failure need to limit their potassium intake doesn't mean that potassium is bad for you, or we should all be limiting the amount of potassium that we take in. And if you want to take this outside of diet for a second, just because antibiotics are great for treating bacterial infections doesn't mean that everyone should be on antibiotics all the time for good health. And actually, the opposite is true. If we were all on antibiotics, that wouldn't be very good for us at all. Now, as far as a ketogenic diet being a treatment for other medical conditions outside of epilepsy, the evidence just really isn't there yet. We have a lot of evidence supporting the use of a ketogenic diet as a treatment for epilepsy. And there is other research going on. That is true. Research into other neurological conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. There's also research into other conditions like cancer. It's happening, and that's a good thing. But we don't have enough evidence from the research on those other conditions yet to have some sort of recommendation that can be given out that everyone with this condition should be on a ketogenic diet as a form of treatment. Now, of course, any individual that has one of these conditions and talks to their doctor and decides that they do want to try a ketogenic diet as a form of treatment, that sort of thing is perfectly fine, because that's that person making that decision with their doctor, even though the evidence isn't quite there yet. But it's still not a standard course of treatment that's going to be recommended broadly to everyone. And even if we do get to a place where the evidence is there and a ketogenic diet is the standard course of treatment for any or all of the medical conditions that I mentioned, or even ones that I didn't mention, that still doesn't mean that it's something that people without these medical conditions should be doing or would benefit from. Something else I want to bring up is that there are people out there who are promoting a ketogenic diet as a treatment for eating disorder, and that is just wrong. Now, I know some of you are thinking, obviously, anyone who would say that is, totally out of line, but I have to bring it up because I have seen some very prominent people who talk about keto say things like this, and it's really a big problem, and it's something that I want to make sure to speak out against. Restrictive diets of any kind are not a treatment for eating disorder, and that includes ketogenic diets. And this isn't just something that happens with keto. This is something I've seen people say who are advocating for all types of diets across the spectrum, so I don't want to pin it on keto alone. It is rampant throughout just the diet community in general, but I do want to say it here because we are talking about keto. This is not a treatment for an eating disorder, and if someone does need treatment for an eating disorder, they need to be working with eating disorder professionals. They need to be working with a doctor and a therapist and a dietitian and a whole team of people who specialize in the treatment with eating disorders and who know what they are doing. I find it incredibly troubling to hear people who have no business talking about eating disorder treatment whatsoever, making recommendations or saying that a diet can treat an eating disorder, going out and putting this type of thing out there. It's really dangerous, and it could lead a lot of people into a lot more pain and suffering and keep them trapped in their eating disorder even longer. Now, I do want to acknowledge that some people do have a winding path to recovery from an eating disorder, especially people who maybe don't have access to the type of treatment or maybe consistent treatment that they need. But with that said, this type of diet is not treatment for an eating disorder, and it's definitely not the recovery place. I've heard these people say, like, now that I do keto, I'm recovered from my eating disorder. No, that's not a thing. And I just find it really troubling that people who have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to this sort of stuff are out there giving advice or telling people that this sort of thing could help them. Something else I want to make sure is clear is I am not a proponent of low-fat, high-carb diets. Just because I'm saying that I'm not a fan of high-fat, low carb doesn't mean that I'm advocating for the opposite of that. I'm not a proponent of diets or restriction, period. Fat is important and you should have some. Protein is important and you should have some. Carbs are important and you should have some. We can only get calories from carbs, fat, and protein, and we need all three of them for meals that are satisfying, food that tastes good, and for good nutrition. And as far as using ketogenic diets as a treatment for medical conditions, I'm really interested to see where that research goes. I mean, I think it's going to be really exciting when we can start to learn more about how ketogenic diets may or may not help with various conditions. I mean, if we find out that a ketogenic diet can be used in the treatment of certain medical conditions, that would be great. It would be another tool in our toolbox for helping people who are dealing with those things. But that doesn't mean that it's something that everyone should be doing, and it has some real negatives that can come with it. So that's my breakdown of the ketogenic diet. If you have any other questions, make sure to leave those in the comments, and I hope you like this video. If you happen to be new here and you want more healthy eating tips and nutrition info and videos like this one, then make sure that you subscribe, because eating healthy and living a healthy lifestyle really doesn't have to be complicated, and I want to show you how to do it. And if you want to watch some more videos, I have a couple linked over here that you might like. Thanks for watching. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll talk to you next time.